abundance of mountains, hills, natural areas, creeks, and beaches contributes to Santa Barbara's reputation as one of the most beautiful areas in the world. We all live in a watershed, land that is drained by a creek system that flows to the ocean. The health of our creeks and beaches is linked to the health of our watersheds. There are 4 major watersheds within the city of Santa Barbara. The Arroyo Burro watershed on the west flows from its headwaters in the Los Padres National Forest down through the Upper State Street commercial area and continues through the Arroyo Burro estuary, ending at Henry's Beach. The Mission Creek watershed, which includes in its upper reaches the Botanic Garden and Rattlesnake Creek, flows through downtown to the ocean near Stearns Wharf. The Sycamore Creek watershed on the east flows through Parma Park and the Riviera neighborhoods, past the zoo, and to the ocean at East Beach. The Laguna Creek watershed, once an extensive estuary, is now mostly below ground in pipes and meets the ocean by Chase Palm Park. Neighborhoods have been built up within these watersheds, edging up against creeks and floodplains. When it rains or when water flows out of yards and driveways, pollution from these neighborhoods gets washed into storm drains which flow directly into our creeks. The effects of this urban runoff have begun to show up on the beach and in the ocean. In order to address these challenges, our community is working to better understand the sources of pollution and educate residents about what they can do to improve water quality. As stewards of this environment, we all play an important role in preserving and enhancing our watersheds. Over geologic time, the land that would become Santa Barbara was formed by sand, gravel, and boulders scoured off the mountains and swept seaward by our local creeks.
Boulders here are Eocene in age, which are tens of millions of years old. And we know that originally those sediments that made the rocks of our pretty honey-colored cliffs up in the mountains actually came from somewhere near San Diego or Mexico. And when Baja broke off millions of years ago, it spread around and slammed these rocks in here. And then about 1 million years ago, up came the mountains forming the Santa Ynez, and a couple 100,000 years ago, Mission Ridge formed.
Santa Barbara's landscape has not always been as we see it today.
Mission Creek at this place flows pretty much east-west, which is kind of anomalous for our streams. Most of them flow from the north to the south, to the ocean. And in here it flows west because Mission Ridge, or the American Riviera, has come up in its path and pushed it to the west about half a mile. And it's come up in response to earthquakes that periodically occur, big earthquakes. And the last one was in the late 1700s that we know pushed this ridge up. So the creek at one time actually flowed from here down through the Rose Garden of the Mission and through the Santa Barbara High School and out into a large lagoon. And once it was diverted, it abandoned all those places. But today the stream comes out near State Street and then flows south.
The orientation of the south-facing coast, along with the mellow climate, abundance of food, and freshwater springs, is the reason that the Santa Barbara Channel has been inhabited by humans since prehistoric times.
Syuktun was a major Chumash town, very important Chumash town. And the reason why so many people settled there is there were springs around the area there near the mouth of Mission Creek. So those springs gave permanent fresh water to the people. Also, the creek itself was, we know from even to the present day, steelhead come up Mission Creek and spawn in the creek. And so there's a fish population in the creek itself, which was used by the Indians.
It wasn't a coincidence that many Chumash villages were established near creeks.
Well, usually along the creeks there are riparian forest and oaks. And of course oaks produced acorns, which were a very important food for all California Indians. And there were other kinds of resources from the creek as well. The pond turtles were used for food, as well as the shells of the turtles were used as rattles in ceremonies and singing and chanting and dancing. Another thing that was present along the Santa Barbara waterfront were these coastal lagoons. In fact, the Spanish name for Syuktun, which was the big Chumash town there, was the Spanish name was La Laguna, because there was a lagoon right in that vicinity. And around the margins of the lagoons were the cattails and tules that were used, and willows that were used for building materials, for thatching the houses. They would build the house with a framework of willow and then thatch it with cattails and tules.
In the late 1700s, the first Spaniards christened their future town site La Laguna de la Concepcion, in reference to this tule-rimmed marsh that covered the lower east side. Governor Portola described Santa Barbara as a dismal place utterly without trees except along the creek beds. However, the Spanish used these natural features to define the boundaries of the town.
The Presidio Commandant and two of the Padres were kind of checking the area out, and the Commandant said, "This is going to be the dividing point right here." And he was standing at Garden and Mission Street where there was a small creek that ran through there. And he said, "This is going to be the separation between the Pueblos, Presidio lands, and the Mission lands. And from here it'll run over to the Cañada de las Pozas, which is the Canyon of the Little Springs, which is now Las Positas Road along in that area." You can see remnants of that little creek. It runs down between Santa Barbara Street and Anacapa and Isla and Pedregosa. Along in that section, there's little remnants of that creek, but it used to be up where Mission and Garden Street is now and kind of ran. That's why that street's at an odd angle, too, because that followed the channel of the creek originally.
Following the settlement of the town, Mission Creek played an important role in providing water.
Back in 1796, the Padres at the Mission were complaining that Mission Creek in July was barely a trickle, and through great dint of industry, which I thought a great term, by great dint of industry, they were able to coax enough water to get down to the Mission to supply their needs. And that's when they realized they couldn't rely on the deity himself, so they built a dam, that is what is now the Botanic Garden, put a dam up there and an aqueduct to bring the water down to the Mission. So they had a nice reservoir to fill up, and they were not content on just the creek itself.
Santa Barbara's oldest existing relics of the early Mission period, the waterworks, can still be seen today. This reservoir was still in use until 1969 as part of the city's water system. Throughout the early to mid-1800s, Santa Barbara grew, and its natural beauty and reputation as a seaside village brought visitors, health seekers, and wealthy Yankees to town.
In the early 1870s, a man named Charles Nordhoff wrote a book about California and why people should come to California. Part of it was the railroad had just been completed across the Transcontinental Railroad, and they wanted people to use that railroad to come out to California. And as far as people knew, California was full of highwaymen, desperados, wild Indians. So Mr. Nordhoff wrote about the benefits, Yosemite, how beautiful it was, the coastal communities, and especially he wrote a whole section on California for health. And he mentioned several places, but he said, of all the places I have mentioned, Santa Barbara is the best, because here one may choose his climate. You're down at the beachfront and it's one temperature. A 20-minute walk further up, you're in a completely different temperature. Montecito has a whole nother temperature altogether. So he said, this is a place for health seekers. The timing was perfect because Stearns Wharf had just been completed, so now ships could tie up and unload passengers safely. And so the community realized the need for a great hotel. So we started getting our hotels coming in, and especially the Arlington Hotel was the #1 major hotel. So people started coming here for the health, breathing the fresh air, the mountain sun in winter, having this nice sun out here. And one of the things they mentioned was the oil vapors. They thought it was a good idea to breathe the oil vapors which came in off the ocean from the natural seepage. But pretty soon, of course, their families came with them, and they got to enjoy it, and they said, this is pretty good. And eventually Santa Barbara changed, not so much primarily as a health seeker's place, but as a destination place for tourists, and especially at first the upper-end tourists who could afford to come out here and spend 2 months or 3 months. But it was the invalids coming here for health reasons that really put Santa Barbara on the map and got us started.
One location in particular became world famous.
Now, in addition to the hot sulfur springs that we also had the world-famous Veronica Medicinal Springs. And that was off in the area that we call Las Positas, the area of the Little Springs. There was these magical waters, and the story is that these were used by the Chumash for a number of reasons to help cure them from things. And the Franciscans found out about it because every once in a while a Franciscan would be sick and one of the Chumash would bring them a little water from the secret stash. They never said where it was from or how they got it. But according to legend, the daughter of one of the Chumash chiefs, whose name was Veronica, she revealed the secret to the Padres, and so it became known as the Veronica Springs. And actually, Veronica Springs Road leads us very near to that area. So eventually, somewhere along the line, someone got the idea of you know, why give away for free what we can bottle and sell? And so the Veronica Springs Medicinal Bottling Company came into being, and so they bottled and shipped this stuff. In the late 1880s is where we first start to see mention of it actually being bottled. But by the 1900s, they were shipping 500,000 bottles out of Santa Barbara to other areas.
In this immediate vicinity, Veronica Springs, which supplies a lot of the water for the Arroyo Burro Creek, I can remember just after the First World War, my parents bringing me to Veronica Springs, where they were starting to bottle that water as a tonic. But actually it was a purgative, and it didn't taste very good.
Now, what was so great about Veronica Springs water? Well, I've got the booklet here. It tells us that it will cure stomach troubles, liver troubles, kidney troubles, blood trouble, bladder, family trouble, rheumatism, and if there's anything left, other troubles, covers it. And so what was so actually magical about the water? Well, scientifically, it contained 2,295.45 grains of mineral matter to the gallon. Unscientifically, it was one heck of a laxative. And that's pretty much what made it do its job so well.
On June 29, 1925, the landscape of Santa Barbara was altered forever.
I was 8 years old when the earthquake struck in 1925, and my father had a cow and a calf across the creek, and he'd go out about 5 o'clock in the morning and milk the cow. So he comes in the house and he said to my mother, I don't know why. He says, but the turkeys and the ducks, and he said, the cow and the calf, they're all jumping around and making noises, and I just can't understand it. Just then the earthquake struck.
13 people died. 65 were injured, and property damage totaled $15 million. Rubble that was so thick along State Street that it blocked traffic also had an unforeseen effect on the lagoon, the very same lagoon that had been so important to the daily lives of the Chumash and the early Spanish settlers.
In 1925, we had a magnitude 6.8 earthquake. And like a lot of places, when all the rubble was in the streets, they picked it up and they dumped it in the closest low spot, and they completely filled the rest of the lagoon. So the lagoon was filled naturally almost to a salt marsh, probably 60,000 years ago, and then the coup de grace was following the earthquake.
As the city recovered, neighborhoods grew. Santa Barbara built up around its creeks and ocean. Many residents explored the natural world of the creeks or used them as corridors to travel around town.
We would go wading out in the creek, and we'd pick up interesting rocks because there were all kinds of strange and interesting rocks in the creek. One year, when my daughter was very small, she and I were out in the creek in like May, and we were wading. There was just a little water in the creek. We were wading out there, and she said, "Oh, Mom, look," she said, "look at that snake over there." And I looked over there, and there was a long worm, about over 6 feet long. I said, "Oh, it's not a snake, it's a worm of some kind, but I've never seen anything like that."
The creek was very much a part of our lives. My sister and I and all the various children that lived around here, because we would play in it and watch the water coursing by during the winter after there had been rains. Some of my most distinct memories about the creek itself involved coming down like to this mud and foliage ledge down here. We would climb down because there wasn't so much of the concrete here then, and we would just kind of build little houses and little streets, and I would take some toy cars down, and we'd just make our own little village, our own little play area. It didn't bother us that we didn't have any city parks around here, because we had East Beach, which we went to just constantly during the summer. Sometimes we would walk in the dry creek to go under the highway. It was not a freeway then, and so we would walk all the way down to where the creek came out near Dwight Murphy Field and just go to East Beach and just spend the summers there.
These stories are not unique. Generations of Santa Barbara children have grown up with the creeks and beaches as their playground.
We moved here in Santa Barbara back in the late 60s, actually partly as a result of the big oil spill. My father had us on the beach cleaning up birds, and he was a teacher here. And I grew up in Mission Canyon, and this was the closest beach to Mission Canyon. So every chance we got to go to the beach, we would spend coming down here to Arroyo Burro, and spent a lot of days when the water was too cold out there actually swimming in the creek itself. And we would put on our mask and snorkel and scoot around in there and look at the fish that we could see in there and chase ducks around. And I learned to surf right out here at Henry's Beach. It was a place where you could be in two different environments. I mean, when you go to the beach and you swim in the ocean. And this is a rare estuary in that it actually has a calm water area that you could go and swim in and play in. This beach, I think, is a jewel for Santa Barbara just because of its setting within a canyon. It does have kelp forests, and the estuary itself as something to see and experience. Today we can at least walk and learn about it from the trails, but I think being able to play in the estuary itself and explore it without worrying about getting sick was an incredible experience.
The effects of urbanization have become more visible. Beach warnings demonstrate that a healthy beach is linked to ocean water quality, a direct result of the quality of the water that flows into it from land.
Some of the biggest impacts to creeks are associated with urban development in watersheds, because when you pave an area for development, it doesn't allow the rainwater to filter into the soil and then slowly seep in and recharge the creek. And in the long run, you end up having less flow in the creek because there's less groundwater to support the creek during the summer and fall when it's very dry out. And during the winter, when you have rainstorms, having that urban development near creeks causes a lot of runoff from the impervious paved landscapes, the parking lots, the rooftops. That water that's running off of the paved urban landscape doesn't have a chance to filter through the soil for the pollutants to be removed. It just carries the oil and grease, fertilizers and pesticides from the urban landscape directly into our creeks. So development next to our creeks is a big problem for our creeks, and again is one of the reasons why steelhead are endangered, and we have so many threatened and endangered species in creeks in Santa Barbara.
Santa Barbara now faces constant challenges to preserve and enhance water quality and protect creeks and creekside habitat, floodplain areas, recreational corridors, and beaches. An integrated look at our watersheds is revealing new opportunities to address these challenges. In the year 2000, voters approved Measure B, which places a 2% tax on visitor stays in local hotels. This established the City of Santa Barbara Creeks Division and generates more than $2 million annually for creek restoration, education, and water quality improvements.
Well, the mission of the Creeks Division is to improve creek and ocean water quality, and we're talking about coastal ocean water, so where people swim and play in the ocean on Santa Barbara beaches. Our mission is also to restore our creek areas and restore our watersheds to the extent possible, improve riparian habitat, improve aquatic environments, provide passive recreation opportunities for Santa Barbara residents and visitors, and make it a safe place to go swimming in the ocean.
A watershed is more than the physical landscape that defines it. A watershed supports a variety of resources, uses, activities, and values where everything is interconnected. Perhaps more importantly, a watershed contains the history and spirit of our community through time.
We all live in a watershed. We often think that we live in a city and we relate to our city by the streets that we travel on. But when it rains, water hits land and that runoff goes into our creeks and then ultimately into our ocean. So everywhere we are in Santa Barbara is within one watershed.
This program, Creeks Through Time, is the first in a series. Future programs will focus on what's in the water, water quality and research, creeks as habitat, and local restoration and community stewardship efforts. For more information about Santa Barbara's watersheds, visit sbcreeks.com.